That garage belongs in a junkyard. The words echoed across the dusty lot as several executives laughed politely behind their CEO. Victoria Hayes lowered her sunglasses and looked around the aging property with obvious disappointment. Rusted signs hung crookedly from weathered walls. Faded paint peeled from the building exterior. A pickup truck older than most of the employees at her company sat parked beside a stack of worn tires. To Victoria, the place looked like a relic from another era. To Daniel Brooks, it looked like home. Daniel wiped his hands on a shop towel and stepped out from beneath the hood of a customer's truck. The afternoon sun reflected off the metal roof above him. For a moment, he simply observed the group standing near the entrance. Expensive suits, luxury vehicles, polished shoes that had probably never touched motor oil. He recognized Victoria immediately. Nearly everyone in the state knew who she was. As Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing automotive technology companies in the country, she appeared regularly on business magazines and financial news programs. Victoria glanced toward Daniel. "You own this place?" she asked. "I do," Daniel answered calmly. One executive exchanged an amused look with another. Victoria folded her arms. "Interesting." The words sounded less like a compliment and more like an observation. Daniel smiled politely. "Can I help you with something?" Victoria turned and gestured toward the surrounding property. "Actually, we are evaluating nearby land." She pointed towards several lots adjacent to the garage. "Our company is considering expansion in this area." Daniel nodded. "Congratulations." Victoria laughed softly. "Thank you." Then she looked directly at the building again. "Although I have to admit, I did not expect this." Daniel said nothing. Years of running the garage had taught him that silence often revealed more than arguments. One of the executives stepped forward. "The area has tremendous potential." Victoria nodded. "It does." Then she added the sentence that would spread through town by the end of the week. "Honestly, that garage is worth little more than scrap metal." Several people chuckled. Daniel remained still. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quiet. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of motor oil and fresh-cut grass across the property. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Traffic passed on a distant highway. Life continued as though nothing important had happened. Yet everyone standing there felt the weight of the remark. Daniel looked at the building. The old garage had belonged to his father before him. It was where he learned to hold a wrench, where he learned responsibility, where he worked late nights after becoming a single father. Every wall carried memories invisible to strangers. Victoria seemed to mistake his silence for agreement. "No offense," she added. Daniel smiled gently. "None taken." The response surprised her. Most people either argued or apologized when confronted by someone powerful. Daniel did neither. "You really are not offended?" Victoria asked. Daniel glanced toward the open garage bay where tools hung neatly organized despite their age. People see value differently. For a brief moment, Victoria studied him more carefully. His work shirt showed signs of years of labor. Grease marked his sleeves. Yet there was something unusual about his calm confidence. Before she could respond, a young girl stepped out of the office carrying a notebook. "Dad," Mrs. Patterson called. Daniel smiled immediately. "Thanks, Emma." Emma Brooks waved politely toward the visitors. Victoria nodded in return. The contrast was striking. Expensive executives surrounded by corporate ambition. A father and daughter surrounded by an aging garage. Yet Daniel seemed completely at peace. Victoria checked her watch. "We should go." The group began returning toward their vehicles. Before entering her car, Victoria looked back once more at the property. The old building stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Worn, imperfect, forgettable. At least that was what she believed. Daniel watched the convoy disappear down the road. Emma walked beside him. "Why were they laughing?" she asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. Then he smiled. "Sometimes people only see what is on the surface." Emma nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. Together they returned to work. Neither knew that somewhere inside Hayes Dynamics, a problem was already beginning to grow. A problem that would soon challenge some of the brightest engineers in the country. A problem connected to a machine nobody seemed able to understand. And when every expert eventually ran out of answers, the last person anyone expected to help would be the quiet single father working inside the garage they had dismissed as scrap metal. The following morning began before sunrise, just as most mornings did for Daniel Brooks. While much of the town still slept beneath a pale blue sky, lights were already glowing inside the old garage. A radio played softly near the workbench. Coffee steamed from a worn metal mug. The scent of motor oil mixed with the cool morning air drifting through the open service bay. Daniel tightened a bolt beneath the hood of a delivery van while mentally reviewing the schedule for the day. School drop-off. 3 repair appointments. Inventory delivery. Parent meeting at Emma's school. The list never seemed to end. Yet he never complained. Life had become a series of responsibilities connected by purpose. At 7 o'clock sharp, Emma entered carrying her backpack and a math workbook. "You forgot breakfast again," she announced. Daniel smiled without looking up. "Good morning to you too." Emma placed a wrapped sandwich beside his coffee. "You always tell me breakfast is important." "That is true. Then maybe you should listen to your own advice." Daniel laughed softly. "Fair point." Emma grinned proudly before sitting near the office window to finish homework. Watching her, Daniel felt the same gratitude he experienced every day. Raising a child alone had never been easy. Some months were harder than others. Bills arrived. Equipment failed. Unexpected expenses appeared without warning. Yet Emma somehow made every challenge feel worthwhile. Around mid-morning, customers began arriving steadily. A retired teacher needed brake repairs. A landscaping company brought in 2 trucks. A young couple stopped by seeking advice about a used vehicle. Daniel greeted each person by name. He listened carefully. He explained repairs honestly. Most importantly, he never charged for work customers did not need. That simple habit had earned something more valuable than advertising: trust. Shortly after noon, an older farmer named Carl Henderson pulled into the garage towing a flatbed trailer. On the trailer sat something unusual. Covered beneath a gray tarp rested a large metal assembly unlike anything normally seen in town. Daniel stepped outside. "Morning, Carl." "Afternoon, Daniel." Carl climbed down from his truck. "Got something strange for you." Daniel looked toward the trailer. "That is obvious." Carl chuckled before pulling back the tarp. Beneath it sat a partially assembled engine prototype surrounded by wires, sensors, and custom machined components. Even covered in dust, it looked expensive. Very expensive. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Interest. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Carl shrugged. "Auction." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You bought this at an auction?" "Nobody wanted it." Daniel moved closer. The design immediately captured his attention. Every component reflected advanced engineering, precision machining, custom fabrication, experimental architecture. Someone had invested tremendous resources into building it. Why was nobody interested? Daniel asked. Carl smiled. Because nobody knew what it was. Emma stepped outside carrying a box of parts. Her eyes widened. "That looks important." Carl laughed. "Exactly what I thought." Daniel circled the machine slowly. The more he examined it, the more curious he became. Several markings had been removed. Identification plates were missing, yet traces remained. Tiny clues hidden in the construction. Design choices, material selections, manufacturing methods. The machine seemed familiar somehow. "What are you planning to do with it?" Daniel asked. Carl scratched his chin. "Honestly, I was hoping you could tell me." For several moments, Daniel remained silent. Then he smiled. "Leave it here." Carl looked relieved. "You interested?" Daniel nodded. "Very." After Carl departed, Emma walked beside her father studying the mysterious engine. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "I do not even know what it does yet." Emma considered this. "That sounds fun." Daniel laughed. "You and I define fun very differently." Throughout the afternoon, he returned to the prototype repeatedly between customer repairs. Each time he noticed something new. Unusual airflow pathways, advanced thermal management systems, design concepts years ahead of what most manufacturers used. Whoever built the machine understood engineering at an extraordinary level. As evening approached, golden sunlight filtered through the garage windows. Most customers had gone home. Emma finished her homework inside the office. Daniel stood alone beside the prototype, carefully examining one of its assemblies. The machine remained silent, motionless. Yet something about it seemed almost alive with possibility. He ran a hand gently across the housing and noticed a nearly invisible marking hidden beneath accumulated dust. 3 letters. H. D. I. Daniel stared at them for several seconds. Recognition flickered across his face. Hayes Dynamics Incorporated. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Somewhere across town, inside one of the most advanced automotive companies in America, executives were likely searching for answers. Meanwhile, sitting quietly inside an old garage they considered worthless rested a machine connected to a story far bigger than anyone realized. For the next several days, the mysterious prototype became the last thing Daniel Brooks looked at each night and the first thing he examined every morning. Customers continued arriving. Oil changes were completed. Engines were repaired. Tires were replaced. Life at the garage followed its normal rhythm. Yet whenever a spare moment appeared, Daniel returned to the unusual machine resting in the far corner of the workshop. The deeper he studied it, the more remarkable it became. One evening after closing, Emma sat at the office desk finishing a science project while Daniel carefully removed a protective housing from the prototype. Rain tapped softly against the garage windows. A work lamp cast warm light across the metal components. "Still thinking about that thing?" Emma asked. Daniel smiled. "A little." Emma laughed. "You have been thinking about it for 4 days. Maybe 5. That is not a little." Daniel could not argue with her logic. He leaned closer to inspect a series of internal assemblies hidden beneath the outer structure. The design was unlike anything he had seen outside advanced research facilities. Every component seemed connected to a larger purpose. Every detail reflected extraordinary precision. Whoever engineered the system was not simply building an engine. They were trying to solve a problem. The question was which problem? Across town, meanwhile, that very question was creating enormous tension inside Hayes Dynamics headquarters. Victoria Hayes stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by senior engineers, project managers, and investors. Large digital screens displayed charts, technical diagrams, and financial projections. Nobody appeared happy. "Give me good news," Victoria said. Silence answered her. Finally, one engineer cleared his throat. "We are still investigating." Victoria folded her arms. "That is not good news." Another engineer adjusted his glasses nervously. "The prototype continues experiencing instability." "After how many months?" Victoria asked. Nobody immediately answered. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Millions of dollars had already been invested into Project Horizon, the company's most ambitious engineering initiative. If successful, the technology could transform an entire industry. If unsuccessful, it threatened years of work and investor confidence. Victoria looked toward the lead engineer. "Tell me exactly where we stand." The man sighed. "We understand what the system should do. And we do not understand why it keeps failing." Frustration settled heavily across the room. Meanwhile, several miles away, Daniel carefully examined a hidden compartment within the machine sitting inside his garage. Something immediately caught his attention. He paused, looked again, then smiled. "Well now," he whispered. Emma glanced up. "What happened?" Daniel pointed toward a small section buried deep inside the assembly. "Someone made a very interesting decision." Emma walked over curiously. "Good interesting or bad interesting?" "That depends." He grabbed a flashlight and continued studying the area. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the original designers had encountered a problem they could not solve conventionally. Instead of redesigning the entire system, they built a workaround. An elegant workaround. Brilliant, actually. Yet it introduced vulnerabilities elsewhere. Daniel sat quietly for several minutes. His eyes moved across components while possibilities formed in his mind. Patterns emerged. Relationships became clear. Suddenly, the entire architecture made sense. Not every detail, but enough. "Dad," Emma asked. Daniel looked at her. "Remember how your math teacher says understanding the question is more important than memorizing the answer?" Emma nodded. "This machine reminds me of that." "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Because I think everyone has been trying to solve the wrong problem." The next morning, he arrived even earlier than usual. Before customers appeared, before traffic increased, before the town fully woke up, Daniel sat alone beside the prototype making notes in a worn notebook. Page after page filled with sketches, calculations, and observations. His handwriting remained neat and organized despite the complexity of the ideas. By mid-morning, the notebook contained an entire theory explaining the machine's behavior. Daniel leaned back and reviewed everything carefully. Then he noticed something that made him stop completely. One serial number hidden beneath a panel matched a sequence he vaguely remembered reading in an industry magazine months earlier. He walked into the office and searched through old publications stacked on a shelf. After several minutes, he found the article. A photograph accompanied the story. Victoria Hayes stood beside a covered vehicle during a major product announcement. Beneath the image appeared a caption discussing Project Horizon. Daniel compared the photograph to the machine in his garage. Slowly, he lowered the magazine. The prototype sitting only 20 feet away was not a forgotten experiment. It was connected directly to the most important project in Hayes Dynamics history. Somewhere inside that company, engineers were likely searching desperately for answers. Yet one of their missing pieces had somehow ended up in a small-town auction and eventually inside a garage they considered worthless. Daniel looked through the office window toward the prototype resting quietly beneath the workshop lights. Then he smiled to himself, because for the first time, he believed he understood something the experts had completely missed. The following week, pressure inside Hayes Dynamics reached a level few employees had ever experienced. Every conference room seemed occupied. Every hallway conversation revolved around the same subject. Project Horizon. What began as an ambitious engineering breakthrough had gradually become a growing concern. Deadlines slipped. Costs increased. Investors demanded updates. And despite the efforts of some of the brightest minds in the industry, nobody could provide a solution that actually worked. Victoria Hayes stood before a massive digital display showing performance data collected over months of testing. Numbers filled the screen. Graphs climbed and dropped unpredictably. Technical reports covered the conference table. Yet none of it changed the reality facing the company. The project remained stalled. "Run me through it one more time," Victoria said. The lead engineer sighed quietly before beginning again. "Every subsystem performs within expected parameters." Victoria nodded impatiently. "And yet, the complete system becomes unstable when integrated." Another engineer leaned forward. "We have replaced components, modified software, redesigned thermal controls, adjusted power management." Victoria folded her arms. And silence. The answer never changed. Nothing worked. Across the room, investors exchanged uneasy glances. Every additional month increased financial risk. Every failed test created new questions. Victoria looked toward the city skyline beyond the conference room windows. She built her company by solving impossible problems. Yet this challenge seemed determined to resist every solution. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, Daniel Brooks was reaching a very different conclusion. The old garage remained busy as always. Customers arrived. Repairs continued. Emma attended school and spent afternoons helping with small tasks around the shop. To most observers, nothing unusual appeared to be happening. Yet every evening after closing, Daniel returned to the mysterious prototype. The notebook beside him continued growing thicker with observations. One night, after Emma finished organizing invoices, she found her father staring thoughtfully at a diagram spread across the workbench. "You have that look again," she said. Daniel smiled. "What look?" "The one where your brain is somewhere else." He laughed softly. "That is probably accurate." Emma climbed onto a stool nearby. "Did you figure something out?" Daniel looked at the prototype. For several moments he remained silent. Then he nodded slowly. "Maybe." Emma's eyes widened. "Really?" Daniel pointed toward a series of interconnected assemblies. "Everyone keeps focusing on the parts that fail." Emma studied the machine despite understanding very little about it. "Is that bad?" "Not necessarily." He smiled. "But sometimes the real answer hides inside the parts that seem to work." Emma considered this carefully. "That sounds like one of those lessons that is secretly about life." Daniel laughed. "Maybe it is." The following morning brought further confirmation of his theory. While examining one section of the prototype, Daniel discovered evidence of repeated modifications. Tiny adjustments. Small redesigns. Engineering decisions layered on top of earlier engineering decisions. To most people, the changes looked insignificant. To Daniel, they told a story. The original design was never the problem. The fixes were. Somewhere during development, engineers encountered a symptom. Instead of finding the true cause, they treated the symptom repeatedly until the entire system became more complicated than necessary. Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled. He had seen the same mistake countless times repairing vehicles. Customers replaced batteries when wiring caused the issue. Mechanics replaced sensors when calibration was the real problem. The pattern remained surprisingly consistent. Complex systems often failed because people stopped asking simple questions. Later that afternoon, an automotive industry news report played quietly on the office television. Emma looked up first. "Dad." Daniel glanced toward the screen. Victoria Hayes appeared during an interview outside company headquarters. Reporters surrounded her. Cameras flashed. Questions echoed from every direction. "We remain confident in the project," Victoria said professionally. "Our engineering team continues making progress." Daniel watched carefully. Most viewers probably saw confidence. He noticed exhaustion, pressure, responsibility. For the first time, he almost felt sorry for her. The woman who dismissed his garage was carrying a burden few people could understand. Emma looked at him. "Do you think she knows?" "Knows what?" "That the answer might be sitting here." Daniel smiled softly. "Probably not." As evening settled across the town, rain clouds gathered overhead. Inside the garage, work lights illuminated the prototype while shadows stretched across the concrete floor. Daniel closed his notebook and looked one final time at the machine. Every piece now made sense. Every decision, every flaw, every solution. He was no longer guessing. He was certain. Somewhere inside Hayes Dynamics, teams of experts continued searching for answers in increasingly complicated places. Yet the truth remained remarkably simple. And before long, circumstances would force the company to consider help from the last place anyone expected. An aging garage they once laughed at, and a quiet single father who already understood the problem better than all of them. By early spring, the atmosphere inside Hayes Dynamics had changed from concern to urgency. What once felt like a temporary engineering obstacle had become a company-wide crisis. Deadlines passed. Demonstrations were postponed. Investors requested private meetings. Industry analysts began asking difficult questions. Every solution produced by the engineering team seemed to create two new problems. The more people worked, the further success appeared to move away. Victoria Hayes stood alone in her office one evening long after most employees had gone home. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. Reports covered her desk. Financial forecasts, technical assessments, project timelines. None contained the answer she needed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said. Her chief engineering officer entered carrying another folder. Victoria looked at it and sighed. "Please tell me that is good news." The man hesitated. "I wish it was." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "How bad?" He sat across from her. "We completed another full system test today. And same failure pattern." Silence filled the office. The engineer rubbed his forehead. "We have brought in specialists from 3 consulting firms." "I know. We have reviewed every subsystem." "I know. We have spent months searching for a solution." Victoria stared out the window. "And we still do not understand the root cause." The engineer lowered his eyes. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Victoria asked the question she had avoided for weeks. "What happens if we cannot solve it?" The answer came quietly. "We suspend the project." The words hung heavily in the room. Project Horizon represented more than a product. It represented years of effort, careers, investments, reputation, ambition. Suspending it would be a public setback no one wanted to imagine. Across town, Daniel Brooks closed the garage for the evening and turned his attention once again toward the prototype. The machine sat beneath bright workshop lights, partially disassembled but carefully organized. Pages of notes surrounded it. Sketches covered an entire section of the workbench. Emma entered carrying 2 sodas from the office refrigerator. "Still working?" she asked. Daniel accepted one with a smile. "Thinking more than working." Emma glanced at the machine. "Did you solve it?" Daniel looked toward the prototype. "I think so." Emma blinked. "You think so?" Daniel laughed softly. "Engineers never say 100% until they test something. But you are close?" "Very close." Emma smiled proudly. To her, this was normal. Her father solved difficult problems every day. Broken engines arrived. Broken engines left repaired. It was simply who he was. What Emma did not realize was that the challenge sitting inside the garage had defeated teams of experts with resources far beyond anything available here. The next morning, events began moving unexpectedly. At Hayes Dynamics headquarters, a special meeting gathered senior engineers from across the company. The mood was tense. Coffee cups sat untouched. Laptop screens glowed. Frustration lingered in every corner of the room. During the discussion, One older engineer quietly flipped through technical reports while others debated possible solutions. He had spent nearly 40 years working in mechanical systems. Experience taught him that answers sometimes appeared where nobody expected. As the meeting dragged on, he noticed something unusual in a report describing missing prototype components that had disappeared months earlier during equipment transfers and liquidation auctions. A memory surfaced, faint at first, then clearer. He looked up. Wait. The room fell silent. Victoria turned toward him. What is it? The engineer adjusted his glasses. I might know someone who should see this. Several people exchanged confused looks. One of our consultants? Someone asked. The engineer shook his head. No. A university researcher? No. Victoria folded her arms. Then who? The older engineer hesitated. He already knew how ridiculous the answer would sound. A mechanic. Silence. Complete silence. Then several people laughed. Victoria frowned. A mechanic? The engineer nodded. A garage owner. More laughter followed. One executive leaned back in his chair. You cannot be serious. I am. Victoria remembered something immediately. An old garage. A quiet man. A dusty property she dismissed months earlier. What is his name? She asked. The engineer looked directly at her. Daniel Brooks. The room reacted exactly as he expected. Skepticism. Disbelief. Amusement. One manager actually smiled. We are talking about a local mechanic? The older engineer remained calm. We are talking about someone who understands machines better than most people understand their own careers. Victoria did not laugh. Something about the certainty in his voice stopped her. She remembered Daniel's calm expression, his confidence, his refusal to be offended. For reasons she could not fully explain, she suddenly found herself listening very carefully. And for the first time since the crisis began, the conversation inside Hayes Dynamics shifted toward a place nobody had ever expected. A small garage at the edge of town, and a single father who might already know the answer everyone else had missed. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Daniel Brooks was replacing a water pump on an aging pickup truck. The garage echoed with familiar sounds. Tools clicked against metal. Air compressors hummed softly. Country music played from an old radio resting near the office door. It felt like any other day, until his phone rang. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Daniel Brooks speaking. For several seconds, the caller introduced herself and explained she was calling from Hayes Dynamics headquarters. Daniel listened quietly. Across the garage, Emma looked up immediately. She recognized the company name. We would like to request a meeting, the woman said. Daniel smiled slightly. A meeting? Yes, sir. About what? A brief pause followed. Project Horizon. Daniel looked toward the prototype sitting in the corner of the garage. He had suspected this moment might eventually arrive. I see. The woman sounded relieved that he understood. Would tomorrow morning be possible? Daniel glanced toward his schedule. Customer appointments filled most of the day. School pickup. Inventory delivery. The responsibilities of ordinary life remained unchanged, even when extraordinary opportunities appeared. Tomorrow afternoon, he replied. I have obligations in the morning. The woman hesitated. Most people rearranged their lives when major corporations called. Daniel sounded as though he were scheduling a routine oil change. Of course, she finally said. Tomorrow afternoon works. After the call ended, Emma walked over immediately. Was that them? Daniel nodded. Yes. Her eyes widened. The big company? The same one. Emma grinned. Do they finally need help? Daniel laughed softly. Maybe. The next day arrived bright and clear. Spring sunlight reflected from office towers as Daniel drove toward Hayes Dynamics headquarters in his old pickup truck. The contrast could not have been greater. Luxury vehicles filled the corporate parking garage. Executives moved confidently through glass entrances. Employees hurried between meetings carrying tablets and reports. Then Daniel stepped out of a truck older than many of the interns working inside the building. Several people glanced his way. Most quickly looked elsewhere. One security guard approached politely. Can I help you? Daniel smiled. I am here for a meeting. Minutes later, he entered the executive floor accompanied by a company representative. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Modern artwork decorated the walls. Everything appeared polished. Expensive. Impressive. Yet Daniel seemed entirely comfortable. The representative eventually opened a conference room door. Inside waited Victoria Hayes, several senior engineers, project managers, and investors. Conversation stopped immediately when Daniel entered. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Daniel recognized some of the faces from months earlier. They recognized him too. Victoria stood. Mr. Brooks. Daniel nodded politely. Ms. Hayes. The memory of their first meeting lingered quietly between them. Victoria gestured toward a chair. Thank you for coming. Daniel sat comfortably. Happy to help if I can. Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. The older engineer who recommended Daniel smiled slightly. He seemed less surprised than everyone else. Victoria opened the meeting. I understand you may have encountered one of our missing prototypes. Daniel nodded. I did. And Daniel looked around the room. Every person appeared eager for answers. Yet instead of launching into technical explanations, he asked a simple question. How many times have you redesigned the thermal compensation architecture? Silence. Several engineers blinked. One looked genuinely startled. Another slowly lowered his pen. Victoria glanced toward her engineering team. 23 revisions, someone answered. Daniel nodded. That explains a lot. More silence followed. This time it felt different. Less skeptical. More curious. The lead engineer leaned forward. How did you know that? Daniel smiled gently. Because I spent 2 weeks studying the prototype. That information was never published. I know. Another engineer frowned. You determined that from the machine itself? Daniel nodded. The room grew noticeably quieter. Victoria watched carefully. The confidence she remembered from their first meeting remained unchanged. Not arrogance. Confidence. The kind earned through understanding. Daniel stood and approached a digital display showing Project Horizon schematics. For several moments, he studied the diagrams. Then he pointed toward a specific section. Everyone keeps looking here. Several engineers nodded. Because that is where the failure occurs. Daniel smiled. No. Confusion spread across the room. That is where the symptom appears. He moved his finger elsewhere on the display. The actual problem starts here. Complete silence followed. Not the silence of disagreement. The silence of people suddenly realizing they might have overlooked something important. The older engineer slowly leaned back in his chair and smiled. Victoria noticed it immediately. For the first time in months, someone in the room looked hopeful. And as Daniel continued examining the schematics with calm certainty, the people who once laughed at an old garage began understanding that they might be sitting across from the one person capable of saving their most important project. For the next 3 hours, the conference room at Hayes Dynamics became quieter than anyone could remember. Daniel Brooks stood before the digital display while engineers, executives, and investors listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody left for another meeting. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing something unusual. Daniel was not speaking in complicated jargon. He was not trying to impress anyone. In fact, his explanations seemed almost disappointingly simple at first. That was exactly why they were so powerful. You assumed instability was caused by thermal variation, Daniel said calmly. Several engineers nodded. Because the data supported that conclusion. Daniel smiled slightly. The data supported the symptom. He pointed toward another section of the system architecture. Not the cause. The lead engineer leaned forward. Walk us through it. Daniel did. Step by step. Decision by decision. Design choice by design choice. Slowly, a new picture emerged. Every modification added over the previous 18 months suddenly appeared in a different light. What engineers believed were solutions had actually been responses to secondary effects. The original issue remained untouched beneath layers of increasingly complicated fixes. The room grew still. One engineer quietly removed his glasses. Another stared at the screen without blinking. Victoria Hayes watched their reactions carefully. She had spent months listening to technical presentations. This felt different. Not because Daniel claimed to know everything. Because his explanation made sense. That is impossible, one engineer finally said. Daniel looked toward him. Why? The man hesitated. Because if you are right, then the original architecture was never flawed. Daniel nodded. Correct. More silence. The engineer shook his head slowly. Then we spent months solving the wrong problem. Daniel did not answer. He did not need to. The expression on every face in the room already revealed the truth. By late afternoon, a decision was made. The company would run one final validation test based on Daniel's analysis. A full team immediately began implementing the recommended adjustments. Engineers rushed toward laboratories. Project managers coordinated schedules. Technical specialists reviewed configurations. For the first time in months, energy inside the building felt hopeful rather than desperate. Meanwhile, Daniel sat quietly in a break room drinking coffee. The sudden shift around him felt almost surreal. Employees hurried through hallways carrying equipment and reports. Yet he remained exactly the same person who had changed a water pump 2 days earlier. Victoria eventually entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. "Thank you." Daniel accepted it. "You are welcome." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria sat across from him. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." She studied him carefully. "Why did you not contact us?" Daniel smiled slightly. "About the prototype?" "About everything." He looked out the nearby window. "Because nobody asked." Victoria laughed despite herself. "That is your answer?" "It is." The simplicity caught her off guard. Most people would have called reporters, contacted investors, demanded attention. Daniel simply continued raising his daughter and running his garage. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. "I owe you an apology." Daniel remained quiet. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." The admission sounded sincere. Daniel appreciated that. Everyone does that sometimes. Not like I did. Daniel took a sip of coffee. "Maybe." Victoria looked toward the laboratory wing, where employees continued preparing for the test. "You never seemed angry." Daniel smiled. "Anger rarely fixes engines." For a moment, Victoria laughed softly. Then she realized he was talking about more than machines. Several hours later, everyone gathered inside the primary testing facility. The atmosphere felt electric. Rows of monitors displayed live performance data. Engineers stood beside workstations. Executives watched from observation areas. Investors filled the rear of the room. At the center stood Project Horizon itself, the machine that had consumed years of effort and millions of dollars. Victoria stood beside the lead engineer. Daniel remained quietly near the back. He seemed perfectly comfortable allowing others to occupy the spotlight. Final checks were completed. Systems activated. Data streams appeared across multiple screens. The lead engineer looked toward Victoria. "Ready?" She nodded. "Proceed." The test began. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then minutes passed. Performance numbers stabilized. Temperatures remained consistent. Efficiency increased. One engineer looked at another. Another checked a monitor twice. Then 3 times. Nobody wanted to say anything too early. Yet everyone could see the same thing. The system was behaving differently. Better. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. Victoria glanced toward Daniel. He stood quietly with his hands folded, watching the data with calm confidence. Not excitement. Not anxiety. Confidence. As if he already knew what would happen. And deep inside the testing facility, the machine that had defeated some of the brightest minds in the industry continued performing exactly as it was always meant to do. The testing facility remained almost completely silent. Hundreds of eyes watched rows of monitors displaying real-time performance data. Engineers stood frozen beside workstations. Executives leaned forward in their seats. Investors watched without blinking. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing a moment that could determine the future of Hayes Dynamics. The machine continued operating. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. For months, failures appeared long before this point. Warning indicators flashed. Temperatures climbed. Performance collapsed. Yet none of that happened. Numbers remained stable. Efficiency remained consistent. The system performed exactly as the original design intended. The lead engineer looked at his screen again. Then again. Finally, he whispered, "That cannot be right." Another engineer checked the same data independently. His eyes widened. "It is right." More people began reviewing the information. Every calculation matched. Every reading confirmed the same conclusion. Project Horizon was working. Not partially. Not temporarily. Completely. Victoria Hayes stood motionless near the center of the room. For a moment, she forgot about investors. She forgot about deadlines. She forgot about media pressure and financial reports. She simply stared at the screens. The solution that had escaped entire teams of experts had been identified by a quiet single father working from an aging garage. 20 minutes later, the final validation sequence finished. A green indicator appeared across the main display. Complete system stability confirmed. The room remained silent for another second. Then applause erupted. Engineers shook hands. Managers smiled for the first time in months. Several people actually laughed from pure relief. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Yet amid all the celebration, Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he had been standing. Calm, quiet, comfortable. The older engineer who first recommended him approached with a smile. I knew it. Daniel laughed softly. You hoped it. Fair enough. Nearby, Victoria continued watching the celebration. Then her attention returned to Daniel. While everyone else celebrated success, he seemed more interested in ensuring the machine truly worked. He reviewed data one final time before nodding with satisfaction. That simple gesture somehow impressed her more than anything else. A few hours later, an emergency executive meeting was called. Investors, board members, and senior leadership gathered around the same conference table that had hosted months of frustration. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. Positive energy filled the room. Confidence had returned. Yet before anyone discussed future plans, Victoria stood and addressed everyone. Before we move forward, she said, there is something we need to acknowledge. The room grew quiet. Victoria turned toward Daniel. This success belongs to the people who worked tirelessly on this project. Several engineers nodded. But it would not have happened without Mr. Brooks. Every eye shifted toward him. Daniel appeared slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Victoria continued. Months ago, I made a mistake. Silence filled the room. No one expected what came next. I judged someone based on appearances. She smiled faintly. Actually, I judged an entire garage based on appearances. A few people exchanged glances. They remembered the story. Victoria looked directly at Daniel. I was wrong. The words carried more weight than any corporate speech. They were simple, honest, public. Daniel nodded respectfully. Thank you. Nothing more. No victory speech. No dramatic response. Just dignity. The room seemed to appreciate him even more because of it. Later that evening, company employees organized a small celebration in one of the headquarters gathering areas. Food arrived. Music played softly. People relaxed for the first time in months. Daniel accepted countless handshakes. Engineers asked questions. Managers thanked him personally. Several younger employees seemed amazed that someone outside the company solved a challenge their experts could not. One finally asked the question everyone wanted answered. How did you figure it out? Daniel smiled. I listened. The employee looked confused. To who? Daniel pointed toward the machine visible through a nearby observation window. To that. Several people laughed. Then Daniel explained. Machines tell stories. Curiosity spread across the group. Every repair, every modification, every design choice. He shrugged. You just have to pay attention. Across the room, Victoria listened quietly. The answer perfectly reflected everything she had learned about him. Daniel was never searching for ways to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He was simply willing to observe what others overlooked. As the evening ended, Daniel prepared to leave. He still had a daughter waiting at home. Life continued. Victoria walked with him toward the lobby. The city lights glowed beyond the glass entrance. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria smiled. You know something? Daniel looked at her. What? She laughed softly. That garage might be worth more than I thought. Daniel smiled. Maybe. Victoria shook her head. No. Her expression became sincere. It definitely is. For a brief moment, neither said anything else. Because sometimes the most powerful victories do not arrive with speeches. Sometimes they arrive in silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. A week later, life at the old garage looked almost exactly the same as it had before. The same faded sign stood above the entrance. The same tools hung neatly on the workshop walls. The same pickup trucks and family vehicles filled the service bays. Morning sunlight still streamed through the dusty windows. The radio still played softly near the workbench. To anyone passing by, nothing seemed different. But sometimes the most meaningful changes happen where nobody can see them. Daniel Brooks arrived before sunrise as usual. He unlocked the front door, switched on the lights, and started a fresh pot of coffee. A few minutes later, Emma walked in carrying her backpack. You are early, Daniel said. Emma smiled. I wanted to help before school. Daniel laughed softly. Or you wanted one of the donuts on the counter. Emma grinned. Both can be true. Their laughter filled the garage. It was the kind of simple happiness money could never buy. The kind built slowly through years of love, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. Later that morning, a familiar black vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Several customers looked up curiously. Victoria Hay stepped out carrying a small box. Unlike her first visit, she arrived alone. No executives, no assistants, no entourage, just one woman walking toward the garage with a thoughtful expression. Daniel looked up from a repair order and smiled politely. "Good morning." Victoria smiled back. "Good morning." Emma waved from the office. "Hi." Victoria waved in return. For a moment, she simply looked around the garage. The building had not changed. Yet somehow it felt completely different to her now. She no longer saw peeling paint or aging equipment. She saw skill, character, history, pride. She saw value. "I brought something," Victoria said. Daniel accepted the box and opened it. Inside rested a small engraved plaque. He read the inscription quietly. "In recognition of extraordinary engineering insight, integrity, and service." Daniel looked up. "You did not have to do this." Victoria smiled. "I know." For a few seconds neither spoke. Then Victoria glanced around the garage one last time. "You know what surprised me most?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What?" She laughed softly. "After everything that happened, you never once tried to embarrass anyone." Daniel considered the question. Then he looked toward Emma organizing paperwork inside the office. "My father used to tell me something." Victoria listened carefully. "What was that?" Daniel smiled. "If you are truly good at something, you do not need to prove it every 5 minutes." Victoria laughed. Then her eyes softened, because she understood exactly what he meant. The greatest victory had never been solving Project Horizon. The greatest victory was remaining the same person before and after everyone finally recognized his value. A few days later, news about the project's success spread throughout the industry. Articles praised Hay's dynamics. Analysts celebrated the breakthrough. Investors regained confidence. Yet Daniel's name appeared only occasionally. And that was perfectly fine with him. He still spent his mornings repairing trucks. He still attended school events. He still packed lunches and helped Emma with homework. Fame had never been his goal. Purpose was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Emma sat on folding chairs outside the garage, watching the sky turn shades of gold and orange. The workday had ended. The town felt peaceful. Emma looked at her father. "Are you happy?" Daniel smiled. "Very. Even though you could probably work at a huge company now." Daniel looked across the property that had belonged to his family for generations. He thought about the garage, the customers, the memories, the life they built together. Then he nodded. "Especially because I do not have to." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither spoke for a while. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the countryside. It was a quiet moment, a simple moment, yet it contained everything that truly mattered. Respect earned without demanding it. Success achieved without arrogance. Recognition received without revenge. And perhaps that is why the story stayed with so many people. Not because a major company was saved, not because experts were proven wrong, but because one single father showed that dignity does not need to be loud. Real strength does not need applause. Sometimes the people others overlook are carrying gifts the world desperately needs. And when those gifts finally shine, they do not create noise. They create silence. The kind of silence that comes when truth finally stands in the light. If this story reminded you that character matters more than appearances, and that quiet perseverance is often stronger than pride, share your thoughts below. And if you believe there is still value in dignity, respect, and second chances, we would be honored to have you join us for another story.